Let's take a look now at the view of industry. There are perhaps a few people, or maybe very few people, better able to give us a perspective on the future of all things cyber and AI than the president of Microsoft, Brad Smith. And we're fortunate to be able to hear from him on these topics now and to hear some thoughts from his book, Tools and Weapons, The Promise and the Peril of the Digital Age. So we're going to show you now an exclusive interview conducted for the Atlantic Future Forum by Air Marshal Edward Stringer, the Director General at the Joint Force Development Defence Academy.
Well, Brad, good morning. Thank you very much for agreeing to get up so early to speak to the Atlantic Future Forum. And your remarks will be centred on this extremely well-reviewed and for good reason book, Tools and Weapons. And as I was reading it, I was struck by just how similar are the main themes to those that we address in the integrated operating concept launched recently by our Secretary of State and the Chief of Defence Staff, i.e. the rise of China, the shift of power to the East, and the revolution in the socio-economy, the fourth industrial revolution as we move to the information age, and how that is going to fundamentally not just change the social economy, but from our perspective, change ways in warfare, hence your title, Tools and Weapons. And I know that my opposite number in the Pentagon is working on very similar concepts, and we're both trying to influence NATO with theirs, as everyone publishes concepts and doctrine for the new era. So this book couldn't be more timely. But it is the Atlantic Future Forum, and I wondered whether we might just expand people's minds by trying to position ourselves, let's say, 10 to 20 years further down the line. Maybe you and I are still talking to the Atlantic Future Forum. What has changed over those 20 years? What has now become commonplace in the information environment as the fourth industrial revolution is now established?
Well, first of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to be with everyone. I and all of us at Microsoft really appreciate it. I do think it's a great question. Let's imagine what the world is likely to look like in, say, the year 2040. Well, I would first start with the fact that China will be the world's largest economy. Africa will be well on its way to becoming the world's most populous continent. Populations will be declining in much of the rest of the world. And the information age that we're living in today will have continued to explode. Certainly 20 years from now, we're going to live in a world of ubiquitous, high bandwidth access to data and computing, both by low Earth orbiting satellites and data centers on the ground. The devices that we carry with us will be even more powerful, but more than being powerful, I think they'll be connected to computing power, not just in the cloud, but really in edge devices that give us the kind of machine learning capability that we're just beginning to experience now. I think you'll have all of this access to data, frankly, coupled with faster, higher speed everything, including obviously hypersonic speed weapons. And then I would just say there will be one thing that I believe will be absolutely constant. The democracies of the world will need to be defended well. I believe that NATO, the relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom, the role of the Five Eyes will be every bit as important 2 decades from now as it is today. And we'll all have to figure out how to harness these advances in technology in a changing geopolitical world.
Thank you very much. So safe to say, as we look ahead, data and its connectivity becomes ubiquitous. It is everywhere. It is all around us. And I ask that because one of the other themes in your book is how you've been struggling to get the rest of us up to speed as you try and explain that changing world. So as I bring you back to the here and now, as we're starting to see what you describe, and we start thinking about information age warfare, there are people who will say, well, you're building in a vulnerability. If you rely on data, then people will get onto your networks, ruin your data, and then you've got nothing. Or even in a more kinetic physical attack sense, and your book starts with describing the huge data center behind hyperscale cloud. Even our own wargaming suggests that rather than attacking airfields and ports at the start of a war, the first thing that people will attack will be your data centers. So I wonder whether you could just address that question of, could we put ourselves into a position where we become over-reliant on data if data is indeed the new oil of the information age?
Well, First thing I would say is we could look back a century ago and say, it's a lot easier to, shoot down an airplane than a member of the infantry. So let's not build them. As technology moves forward, the real challenge is to make use of what technology brings while identifying, acknowledging, and protecting against new vulnerabilities. I mean, that's the other side of the coin. And I do think it is something that we need to protect against. Part of the way we protect against it is sort of our philosophy as a company. We call it intelligent cloud and intelligent edge. You distribute data everywhere, and you put it as close as you can to the people who need it, including those in combat. That's the first way you protect against that vulnerability. I think there's a second obvious way that the leading military organizations are protecting against this vulnerability. Data centers get built under the ground, so they're hardened targets. I do think that it will be impossible to wipe out data because it will be so ubiquitous. There will be so many data centers everywhere. But I do think that it's right to think of it as a vulnerability. And it's why we always back up data in another location, typically hundreds of kilometers or miles away. But we should be talking together. I actually very much welcome the question about how we protect, what are basically the equivalent of the electrical power plants of our age, so that we recognize that the harm that would be inflicted, not just on military capability, but economic and societal resilience, if they were to be targeted either by kinetic weapons or cyber attacks.
So quite a lot of experimentation for us all to do to work out, as we always have in the past, that battle of measures and countermeasures. But data is going to be prevalent, and we are going to have to rely on it and seize the opportunity therein. If I could get back to that point I made earlier, that you were having to get the rest of us up to speed with the realities of the modern world. And it struck me that the number of times you just referenced in passing going right to the highest levels of government. And I found that interesting in the West Wing, for example, having to advise the highest levels of government rather than going through another government agency. And there's a line in your book about someone referred to as, well, you're almost a pseudo or proto-state. And that's very interesting when you think about the power you wield with data, the ability to move data across borders, et cetera, the money you have at your disposal. Could you say a little bit more then about how states should think about working with the really big companies and corporations such as yours, and what that means for regulation?
I would say a few things. I mean, first, I always think it's important to recognize that tech companies are not governments. We are responsible to governments around the world, especially in the world's democracies. People elect the leaders that govern us. They don't elect us. And so we obey the law. We are part of these societies. But second, unlike, say, a government, we're global. And that global reach, that ability to move quickly across borders, is something that gives us an opportunity not just to sort of learn from what's going on around the world, but work with people in multiple countries. I do think when you put those things together with just the tremendous impact that data and digital technology are having on the world, what it really means more than anything else is that we be doing things like this, talking together about what the future looks like, what are the issues that are being raised. One of the anecdotes we share in our book was when I did go into the West Wing of the White House to share with the Homeland Security Advisor in late 2017 our plan to disrupt North Korean cyber capability that was being used to attack hospitals in the United Kingdom, among other places, as well as many other resources. And we had informed a number of other people in the government already, but that news hadn't traveled to the West Wing before I got there. We all live in this world where I think it's not a command and control for the flow of information, and mostly what that means is we need more information to flow more quickly, especially among those of us who are working together.
But that's a wonderful example. It just demonstrates how closely you work with the agencies of the state over some vital national security matters. And I wonder then what that tells us about the way we need to think about partnerships with tech, IT, data companies, and whether the relationships that we built for the industrial age, or the methods of building those relationships, very contractual, the sort of stuff you put in place to buy hardware, is that still viable as a method when we're dealing with fast-moving software and the way that needs to be updated and kept absolutely at the cutting edge?
I think there's some really interesting opportunities for us to innovate and learn together. Certainly for us as a company, we've approached our work with, say, the military in the United Kingdom and the United States with a set of first principles. We have said that we will provide all of the technology that we create, to defend our two countries, as well as other NATO allies, as well as other democratic allies around the world. We want the people who defend us to know that they have our back. But we've also said there's a lot of new issues being raised. We should expand the conversation to include them, including the issues of, say, artificial intelligence and ethics. But I would say even more than that, what I have found is there's some interesting opportunities to innovate in the procurement space, as you suggest. The interesting thing for the tech sector is that, frankly, we don't come to everything with the deep familiarity that other traditional military contractors might have. That may lead to awkward moments at times if we don't quite appreciate the customs of the work, so to speak. But it gives us an opportunity to think anew. One of the things I really like about the approach that we've taken to contracting on cloud services, for example, is that we enter into a contract, but we get paid only if the cloud services are used. And so I love actually having to work at a place where we get paid only if what we provide you is useful to you. So that, to me, is a new principle that we can inject into this. And then I think we can build on that with real innovation in the development cycle. One of the examples that has excited me is some of the work we're doing with the United States Army around our HoloLens augmented reality technology. And we have software developers, engineers literally on the same site as troops are testing the prototypes and the like. And when we, together with members of the Army, identify some new ways we can make this work better, our engineers just write code in real time. We don't worry about whether that was within the scope of the contract. In some literal term, we don't bring in lawyers to come read it. It's like we have a mission, and I think the more we can focus on the mission and advancing it, I think the better served our countries will be.
Well, we have a much smaller program running here on signal synthetic environments, working exactly the same way. And I think it is the future, but it threw up a lot of policy and contracting challenges to do it. And I think you're leading the way there, and it's something we really do need to explore quite quickly. In your answer, you brought up that topical, thorny subject, artificial intelligence. Huge opportunities in artificial intelligence and machine learning. But, of course, when applied to warfare, it throws up immediately some really deep ethical questions. And you have wrestled with similar questions throughout. And I just wondered whether you had any thoughts on how we approach the ethics of the information age, especially from a security and defense perspective.
Well, I would say two things about this. First, I think this is a really important conversation for us to have, in part because there are some new issues that are clearly arising. It's really about machine capability to make decisions in an age of hyper speed based weapons. So we run a new risk, really for the world. If we have defects in design, if there's imperfections in safety, or there's just not the well-grounded approach in ensuring that human beings remain in control. And I think in both Washington and London, there's been really important work over the last 2 years to devise ethical principles to address this. one of the things that is so impressive to me is that with both the UK and the US, when we talk about the military, as you all know, we are talking about deeply ethical institutions, with training and rules and processes and systems, so that ethics are not only devised but followed. But that brings me to the second thing that I think we should do. Much of the world, many of the people in our own countries are not as familiar with this. So oftentimes when I'm even talking to employees at Microsoft or other tech companies, I have young computer software engineers stand up and say, we need our troops to understand ethics. And I remind them that you don't graduate from West Point without taking a course in ethics, but you can get a computer science degree without taking such a course. And I think we need to make this conversation somewhat more public and much more accessible, because we constantly have to win over and retain the confidence of our citizens.
So if I could build on that answer, Brad, if I may, do you think there is scope then to take forward, if you like, our educational processes in a more joined up way, so we understand all these various facets? If we are going to be working closely together, we are going to have to be working at speed, such that the computer scientist understands the military view of ethics and vice versa. It's certainly something we're looking at in the integrated review at National Security College, and I just wondered whether you had a view on that.
I absolutely do. I think it is such an important opportunity, and we can do it in such a wide variety of ways. I always welcome the opportunity when we have military leaders come to, say, our headquarters near Seattle, not just to come and do what they've come to do, sit down. We typically meet, plan out what we might do next together. But I always like to create forums to invite employees. We have hundreds of British employees working here in Seattle. They're always interested in connecting with people from the UK. And that's just one slice of what I think we can take and need to take into the higher education community, and then to the public, really in the broadest sense as well.
And you've introduced international there, and through your book Ethics, you talk about the fact that cyberspace can be misused by people, especially if they're not as bound by the same code as we like to think we are. And we need responses to it. And those responses will not be symmetric if people are doing the wrong thing to us. And I think the Skripal case in Salisbury in the UK is a case in point where we mobilised the international community very rapidly. But of course, that hinges on attribution. And you bring that up several times in the book. I wondered whether you could just link those two thoughts about how we pull, if you like, the liberal democratic bloc together, and how we get better at attribution such that we can move quickly to look after our interests and push back against people who would do us harm and use nefarious ways to achieve that.
I believe it's a critical challenge that we do need to do more to address. We're living in this period of time that it's certainly not necessarily war, but it doesn't feel entirely like peace either. It's this gray zone where we see these constant cyber attacks. And we're seeing them from 4 countries in particular: Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And where we started 5 years ago, I think we thought about this principally in terms of attacks on, say, conventional infrastructure or, say, our military capabilities. But today, I think it's just become an onslaught on democracy itself. With the hacking and weaponizing of emails, with disinformation campaigns. And I do believe it's one of the greatest risks to the protection of our democracies today. There are 76 democracies in the world. 47% of the world's people live in them. But we need to protect them in new ways. We've got to get this out of the shadows and put it under the spotlight. And I think that means, first, we need great technical work by companies like ours and people, especially in the intelligence community and cyber command and the like, to identify when these attacks are taking place. Second, I think we need to have the courage to speak up and to speak up together. That's why we as a company have leaned in. We just published a new digital defense report where we go into great detail about what we're seeing come from all 4 of these countries. But especially after, say, WannaCry or NotPetya, it was extremely valuable to have a number of allied nations attribute these attacks to North Korea and then Russia together. And then third, I think we need to keep working to ensure that the rules are clear, especially when we look at these things like disinformation campaigns. It concerns me when the threats have outpaced the rules. And if the rules don't catch up, then I think we won't have the full power of persuasion when we do act together. And then finally, I think one thing that has been very important, there need to be consequences. And I think there have been some important steps forward in the last couple of years, deterrent capability and the like. But we should be treating this as, I think, the very serious threat it has become.
Brad, that's a brilliant answer to end on, because I think our 20 minutes are up. You've answered that question, what are we defending against these days? We're not defending territory. I think you've given us a very good answer. We're defending democracy. And you've given us some suggestions there, some real hard suggestions for hard policy choices, which is exactly what the Atlantic Future Forum is set up to discuss. So thank you very much for sharing those thoughts with us. I think they've set up the debate wonderfully, and could I thank you on behalf of the forum, and could I thank you as well for getting up at 7:30. I wish you a very good day.
Thank you very much. I wish I was with you in person. I look forward to being there in the future.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And thank you to both Brad Smith, of course, and to Air Marshal Stringer.